apologize. Okay, the Karaite, Egyptian Karaite Haggadah. First thing I should tell you is that we don't have the 4 questions, right? So the first question I always get is, what is the tune of your 4 questions? We don't have the 4 questions, right? But I used to know it, and I used to know it all by heart. But I haven't, I'm out of practice, I should say. But so we don't have the 4 questions. The Karaite Haggadah is almost made up entirely of biblical texts. If you guys have a moment to go to there's a website called the Karaite Corner, karaitecorner.org, corner with a K. You can actually download an English translation of the Egyptian Karaite Haggadah, and he did everyone a great service by putting in bold the portions that are not biblical, meaning not directly taken from the Torah or the Tanakh. And you could see how few verses there are in the Haggadah. Towards the end, when you get to the blessings, of course, blessings are not necessarily there, but you can see how few verses are not from the Tanakh. So the Karaite Haggadah is almost entirely biblical. It contains numerous psalms praising God and mentioning the Exodus, and it mentions Moses by name. I don't know if you know this, but there's actually a custom, or I don't want to say custom, but it's somehow evolved that in many rabbinic Haggadot, there are, it doesn't mention Moses by name. Some of them mention Moses once. Some of them make no reference to Moses at all. Some may mention Moses indirectly. It's a fairly recent phenomenon, but open your Haggadah when you go, especially if it's an Orthodox Ashkenazi Haggadah. You'll see that that's the case. And but the Karaites, we don't have this custom at all. So it mentions Moses 5 or 6 times. I don't remember exactly. One thing to show you, this is actually the opening words of the Karaite Haggadah. B'shem Goel Yisrael Hanidrash Lechol Shoel. So this says, in the name of the Redeemer of Israel, Hanidrash Lechol Shoel, who responds to all who seek him, or who has an answer for all who pray. That's the opening line. It's not from the Bible. It's something extra biblical. And then it goes into Psalms 111. Well, one of the things that I've done is I go to conferences and I represent the Karaite Jews of America. And at one conference, someone came up to me and said, "You must be Sean." I said, "Yes." He says, "My name is," I won't tell you his name because I'm recording this and I don't know if he wants to say it. He goes, "My name is so-and-so. I taught your father Hebrew in Egypt. So when my father was a young man, he was learning Hebrew from a Karaite in Egypt. And he said, by the way, are you familiar at all with the Karaite Haggadah?" I said, "Yeah, of course. Like, do you know how it starts?" And I told him how it starts. And he said, "Would it surprise you if I told you I have a Haggadah that's handwritten from the 1800s in my possession that has a different opening?" I said, "Yeah, it would surprise me because everyone wants to believe that their tradition is unchanged from Moses to this day. This is Moses' Haggadah. How can you tell me it's changed?" Well, what's interesting is he actually has a different opening to his Haggadah in this handwritten one. So he uses this Haggadah over here, like as his family does. But in his family archives, he has a separate Haggadah, and it says B'shem Goel Yisrael, which is the same thing. So in the name of the Redeemer of Israel, Miyad Esav veYishmael. So in the name of the Redeemer of Israel, or the name of the person who saved Israel from the hand of Esau and Ishmael, which is basically at some point in the Karaite Haggadah, or maybe just this person, it said something to the fact, thank God who has kept me safe from, I'll just say, my Arab neighbors. So I do not know when it was written or why it was written or the context of it, but there is at least one person who has a Haggadah that has a different opening to it, and it's something that I personally am going to look into at some point to figure out if this is an anomaly or whether there was a historical tradition of thanking God that you're safe because there was hostility in the Arab lands toward the Jews. So I don't know about that. Any questions so far? Yeah. It's actually the same continuation. So the word hallelujah here, and then the word hallelujah here, and then they're both Odeh Adonai b'chol levav, Odeh Adonai b'chol levav, b'sod yeshurim ve'eda. So it's actually the same. Great. Okay, so I cannot give you the tune of the 4 questions. So I've decided that I have to give you some Karaite melody, and the melody I'm going to give you is the melody that is sung during the 10 plagues. Now, if I remember my rabbinic education, is it the case like during the 10 plagues you stick your pinky in a thing of wine and put it on your plate and you do that 10 times? And you diminishing the wine. So diminishing the wine, exactly. And we'll talk about wine in a second. But this is the Karaite melody for the 10 plagues. So I actually want to point out to you what I think every young Karaite who learns the Haggadah, the first word they learn in the Haggadah is kakatuv, because it just sounds like kaka. And I just, that's like the first association. But it's actually a very important word from a Karaite perspective. Does anyone know what it means? As it is written, right? So the purpose of being a Karaite, obviously, is to look straight to the text. And the word kakatuv is in the Karaite Haggadah many, many, many times. And in fact, the non-biblical portions of the Karaite Haggadah that I pointed out to you, or mentioned to you earlier, it paraphrases something from the Torah, or the Tanakh, but usually from the Torah. And then it says, kakatuv, as it is written, and then it quotes the verse from the Torah, explaining it exactly. All right, the Karaite Seder table. All right, bad news for everybody who wants to go to a Karaite Seder. There's no wine at a Karaite Seder. Now, I know in the rabbinic tradition you have 4 cups of wine. Is that correct? Or grape juice, exactly. Or grape juice. So, but in the Karaite tradition, in the majority Karaite tradition today, wine is strictly prohibited on Passover. Does anyone who's not a Karaite know why that might be?
Inebriating.
It's inebriating. Okay. So it says no fermented foods and no wine. So, but why would the Karaites care about fermented foods? It's chametz. Okay, so that is actually the Karaite answer, is that it's chametz. So in the rabbinic tradition, so we're going to talk about that right now. So in the rabbinic tradition, chametz means leavening, and it only applies to grains. So it cannot mean anything else for the purposes of the Passover prohibition. Okay, and if you think about it, that makes sense, right? The holiday is called Hag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it makes sense that if you're going to avoid certain things, you're going to avoid certain grains that would leaven, or all that stuff. Now here's the Karaite, the majority today Karaite view on this, is that the Torah calls vinegar chometz yayin, fermented wine. And chometz yayin, fermented wine, chometz and chametz is the exact same linguistic root. So the Karaites look at this and say, well, clearly the concept of chametz does not just apply to grains. It applies to things beyond grains. And for that reason, the majority of Karaite view today is to not eat anything fermented during Passover. Now, I should tell you there was a historical divide about this amongst the Karaites. We're Jews. Jews disagree. That's of course. I heard somebody say, of course. So in the rabbinic tradition, you have Ashkenazi Jews who tend to be from European countries, and Sephardic Jews who are from Spain and North Africa, and Mizrahi Jews who are from, Iraq, Iran. You can figure out exactly, Yemen maybe. The Karaites actually don't have those types of divisions. Generally speaking, the historical divisions were all philosophical. Generally speaking, you do have, views that became popular in certain areas, but it wasn't a divide that you would see with respect to Ashkenazi and Sephardic. So there were some Karaites historically who disagreed and said that chametz actually only applies to grains. But today, I can tell you it's the practice of the Karaite community in Turkey, the practice of the Karaite Jews from Egypt, and the practice of the Karaite Jews in Israel today not to have anything fermented on Passover. Maror made from greens and lemon peels. Now, my understanding from, again, my rabbinic education is that in the rabbinic tradition, you're eating bitter greens, right? So the idea is that all things are green, and that's generally the Karaite view. But we actually throw lemon peels in there because I guess the greens aren't bitter enough, and we have to do that. Now, what's interesting is when I think lemons, I think sour, right? That's kind of what this face is, right? But the lemon juice is sour, and the peel is actually bitter. I had to look this up when I was preparing this talk to see why in the world is lemon in the Karaite maror. And then finally, the Karaites make homemade matzah. It's actually a tradition in the Karaite communities that you would actually make your matzah for yourself. And again, if you pick up one of the Karaite fact card sets, there's 12 sets, one of the things in there is a Karaite matzah recipe. So it's the Egyptian Karaite recipe, and my friends who are not from Karaite families who taste it, they tell me how amazing it is. And one of the reasons it's amazing is because it's got coriander in it. And coriander gives it this nice, rich taste. Now, I know that some Ashkenazi Jews don't eat coriander because of the kitniot issue. So just be advised. You can also make it without coriander. And I will tell you that the matzah we use for the Passover Seder itself doesn't have the coriander, right? The point is to have bread of affliction during the Seder. So we have one that's very similar to this. We make it in a round shape, and there's generally no coriander in that, in that one for the Seder. And then the rest of the night or the rest of the week, we use this one that has coriander.
When you say coriander, are you talking about the seed or the leaf?
The seed, right? The seed? Yes, the seed. And you can actually see some of the seed. Oh, wait, I have this pointer here. You could see some of the seeds here in this picture here.
So when you say no wine, is that, but you do drink grape juice?
We do grape juice. And in fact, the Karaite custom is to actually freshly squeeze grape juice that day and have that for your Passover Seder. No chance of fermenting because it's done that day, exactly. There's also, I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh yeah, and so sometimes the wine is made out of raisins as well, so, or the grape juice is made out of raisin juice. Any other questions so far? Great. Okay, so the Passover lamb and Chiquita. So we talked earlier about the Passover sacrifice, and the Passover sacrifice in the Torah is called the Pesach. And so that's why I wanted to clarify that when I say Pesach, I'm generally meaning the Passover sacrifice. And what's interesting, Pesach is a very, very common Karaite Jewish name, last name. My mom's maiden name is Pesach, and it's, I'd say, one of the top 2 or 3, if not the top 1, most common Jewish name amongst the Karaite Jews, last name amongst the Karaite Jews. And the tradition is to have lamb that has been recently slaughtered. So the gentleman over here, Eli, would you just raise your hand? Eli is visiting from the Karaite community of Israel. He actually went out recently and slaughtered 3 lambs for Passover, and he's probably going to slaughter a few more, and 3 more, maybe 10 more. Anybody wants some, let us know. The idea is that on the night of the Seder, you should have roasted lamb. Why? Because the Passover sacrifice was roasted, and the Exodus from Egypt, all that stuff. I should point out that in the Orthodox Ashkenazi tradition, you don't have anything roasted at your Seder. And my understanding is that the Sephardic Jews will eat lamb at their Seder. I don't know if it's roasted or not. But the Karaites, actually, it's a custom to have roasted lamb. And I have 2013 there just to remind me, one of the differences between the Karaites and Rabbinites with respect to their dietary laws is that in the Karaite tradition, you cannot slaughter a pregnant animal. It's absolutely forbidden. And I could talk to you about that why later. But in 2013, my uncle, who usually slaughters the lamb for my family, went to the farm, and he would not slaughter a single lamb because they were all pregnant. The person looked at him like he was crazy, like, well, who cares? But my uncle said, no, it's absolutely forbidden. So he wouldn't slaughter it. Okay, so on the right here is a manuscript, and the author of the manuscript is here. I won't mention his name. This is from 55 maybe years ago. This is the Karaite laws of Chiquita, and this is how they were learning in Egypt. You could see that at the top it says Inyan Chiquita, so the issue or the matter of Chiquita, and then under it, so it's there in Hebrew, and then under it, it's written in Arabic. So they were writing the Hebrew text, and under it, he was writing the Arabic translation of it so that he understood exactly what was being taught. It was very common for Karaites in Egypt to do this, to learn the laws of ritual slaughter. And if you ever have a chance to go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the oldest dated Hebrew manuscript or Hebrew language manuscript at the Library of Congress is actually the Karaite laws of Chiquita. So it's actually an interesting point there that if you ever make it out there, maybe you can have a chance to see it. Okay, so we talked earlier about how I generally enjoy talking about people working together and how the Karaites have enjoyed relative autonomy in Israel up until recently. Recently, the Israeli religious authorities have been giving the Karaites a lot of problems. So one problem they gave the Karaites is they said, well, your butcher shop has the word kosher on it. Kosher might mislead rabbinic Jews who don't know you're Karaites, and we don't want them to be misled. So we're going to fine the butcher shop, 1,000 shekels or something like that. Now, the issue is not the money, right? If it's an issue of the money, the community can raise the money in a second to pay it off. The problem is that the Karaites do not want a precedent of you can bully us around and say, you majority Jewish movement has exclusive rights to these terms. So they fought it in court. Well, and they ended up winning. In fact, the case pitted the Karaites against the Rabbinites in front of a Muslim judge. And the Muslim judge, in fact, ruled in favor of the Karaites. So we were hoping that the issue would be dead, but just recently, before Passover, the Israeli religious authorities issued a decree saying that any independent slaughterhouse that wants a kosher certification, let me explain what I mean by independent slaughterhouse. There are places that have slaughterhouses where you or I or anybody can go and actually just take an animal and slaughter it. I don't have to be affiliated with the entity. I don't have to be affiliated with anybody. It's independent for that reason. You just go and reserve your time, I guess. So the Israeli religious authorities issued a ban and said, you are not allowed to allow Karaite Chiquita in these independent slaughterhouses. And the idea is that if they want to keep their kosher certification, they would have to abide by this. So there's a news periodical in Israel called Yediot Ahronot, and they interviewed the chief Hacham of the Karaite community. His name is Hacham Moshe Feruz, about this issue. And said, it's 5 questions with him about what's going on. And I will say that he's a very, very likable and savvy public speaker. So the first question they ask him is, roughly how many people are going to be affected by this ban? And he says 40,000 Karaites in Israel are going to be affected by this because they can't get meat for their holidays, right? And then he doesn't leave it at that. He says, and these Karaites are well integrated into Israeli society. They go to universities, they serve in the army, and they pay their taxes. They're not living off the government. And he's letting them know that in Israel today, there's a group of Jews who doesn't want to serve in the army, doesn't want to be integrated in Israeli society. Why are you picking on us? Now, he's not saying that directly, but that's what he's doing. So very wise and savvy man. And in any event, I as somebody who promotes Jewish unity and Jewish harmony, as a Karaite, I am humble enough to know that the Karaite tradition, from a purely theological perspective, it could be wrong. I'm humble enough to know that. I'm humble enough to know that the Messiah might come to me tomorrow and say, you know what, guys, you were wrong. I, the Messiah, am a Rabbinite. I'm like, whoa, huh. But one of the reasons why I'm humble about that is I know that that's a possibility. And I wish that the people who would put bans on other people would realize that there's a possibility that they are wrong too. And realize that we're all one people wanting to respect our traditions and worship God in the way that we believe is the right way to do. And that's my soapbox part of this presentation. Yeah?
Why is this happening now?
Ellie, do you know why now as opposed to 15 years ago or 20 years ago? Yeah. Oh, okay, so that's actually part of it. So one of the reasons that the Karaite butcher got fined is because there's actually a new supervisor in the area who just walking by and he's like, this looks weird to me, and didn't realize that the Karaites have a separate tradition and all that stuff, so he issued a fine. But once the fine was issued, the Rabbanut, or the Israeli religious authorities, stood behind him for it. But I should tell you, one of the main problems with this is that, okay, the Karaites might win this battle in court or might win that battle in court, but think about the amount of resources that a small community is being used on legal fees and their energies. They'd rather use it in teaching people how to observe, so. All right, so the Karaite Jews of America, one of the things that they're doing is we are recording stories of Karaite Jews who lived in Egypt. Because this generation of Jews is dying and they won't be here too far into the future, hopefully much longer, but realistically speaking, this is the last of that generation. And we're recording their stories, and some of their stories are fascinating. I recently interviewed a woman who passed away. I actually got the interview before she passed away. And she came to the Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem and gave the Devar Torah every week for 5 or so years in her 80s. And so it's fascinating for me to get her stories. This gentleman is... oh, I said in Jerusalem, I'm sorry. Synagogue in Daly City, not Jerusalem. Thank you very much. I should tell you, I'll tell you why I thought about Jerusalem after this clip, because it has something to do with this clip. When you guys think of the Exodus and the 10 plagues, what do you guys think of? Is there any plague or any moments that you think of? Parting the sea. So prior to that, I heard someone say angel of death. Yeah, the angel of death and death of... What did the Jews do to make sure that... Yeah, exactly. So they put the blood on the doorpost. All right, well, listen to this.
At Passover, the month Passover, my father used to buy a live lamb, cheap, and we put the lamb in the backyard, and I used to feed him until the time to butcher. We had a kosher butcher coming to slaughter him. And of course, as a tradition, we were supposed to put our hands in the blood of the lamb. And my father used to lift him up and put marks on the door seal.
Okay, so that is exactly what was done in the Bible, right? Now, no Karaite today believes that's a commandment. That was just something done to commemorate the night of the Exodus. All right, so the reason why I said Jerusalem is because this is, obviously you could see I edited this. This is part of a larger clip where he said, and you could see it affected him, right? He's talking about it a little bit emotionally. He says that he actually didn't want to eat the lamb that year because, you know, he had this lamb for a month or whatever, and he would feed him. And his mom would always say to him, you have to eat your food, you have to eat your lamb, so you can go to Jerusalem. And as a 5-year-old kid, he didn't understand what Jerusalem was. Like, what is Jerusalem? Why are you talking to me about Jerusalem? You know, all I know is this lamb was just in my backyard, and now I'm eating it, right? He talks about his family's experience leaving Egypt, and every Karaite family and every Jewish family leaving Egypt had a decision to make. Where do you go? Do you go to Israel or do you go to somewhere else? His father desperately wanted to move to Israel. And he told his dad, no. Let's go to the U.S. We can go to Israel later. You'll go to Israel later. And so they came to the U.S., and his dad died never having gone to Israel. And so he tells me elsewhere in the interview that he felt guilty over this. Anyway, at the end of this sequence that I edited out, he says, you know, it took me 70 years, but I finally made it to Jerusalem. And so, and he connects it with this memory as a child of his parents telling him about Jerusalem, and that he has to do it so he can go to Jerusalem. And it took him 70 years, and he finally made it to Jerusalem.